the mic, brother.
Am I on? Oh, good. Thank you very much for this warm African welcome. It's a pleasure to be here in this sacred place because there was a time when we walked daily in sacred places, that everything we did had a sacred significance because we lived according to ritual. Life was a ritual because ritual is that which connects you with the divine. So that you walk ritualistically, that means you walk with the divine. That is home. That is where the real home is, you see. And what we find now is Africa, through her spiritual reality, is calling us home. In following up on this poem, I'd like to just read something to you and talk a little bit about black holes. And then we can kind of get into the heart of the matter. And there was even a novel written called The Heart of Darkness. And we are going to get into the heart of darkness, calling this chemware and dark matter. This is from a scientist describing dark matter. Dark matter is strange stuff. It is all around you, but you can't see it. It is whistling by your ears, but you can't hear it. It is arguably the most important material in the universe. But until recently, scientists had no idea that it existed. It will decide the fate of the universe, but we have no idea what it is. Now I'm going to read you from a quotation from E.A. Wallace Budge, Gods of the Egyptians. The older company of gods have been described as personifications of aspects or phases or properties of primeval matter, and may thus be enumerated. Nu-nut, because they're always paired. In the ancient African conception, there is no male without female, no female without male, ever. You never have them separate. They always come together. There is no universe without that complementarity there. Nu-nut is the boundless primordial fluid mass. Hehu-hehut is limitlessness and infinity. Amen-ament is the hidden and the invisible, and Kekui-kekut is the primary darkness. This describes the state of existence prior to the onset of this universe. Also from E.A. Wallace Budge, Osiris. Hail Osiris, stand up, rise up, like Bob Marley said. Stand up, rise up. Thy mother Nut gives thee birth. Thy two sisters make thee to journey. In thy name, Chemware, the great black one. So we have the sense of blackness being at the very heart and the essence of the beginning of things, right at the very beginning of the African development of their worldview. You see, because the thing about what they found out about dark matter in the universe is that it makes up between 90 to 99% of the universe. So this is why in the ancient African conceptions they say light is born from darkness. Because darkness is the primeval reality. In fact, it exists really in our own sense of ourselves. Why? Because neuroscientists have determined that the brain, the mind, is 10% consciousness and 90% unconsciousness. 90% darkness, if you will, like, 10% light. But that everything that we are, therefore, is embedded, buried, contained, enfolded in that womb-like 90% of unconsciousness. So you can begin to see the significance of the great black, of the great chemware. Let's talk about black holes. Black holes is a condition, is a celestial condition that occurs when a huge, massive star, maybe 10 to 100 times the size of our own sun, at the end of its life, collapses down. And in collapsing down, it collapses down so far that it gets to a place of such massive, unimaginable density and weight that it creates so much gravity that nothing can escape from it, not even light. That is the reason why it is called black holes. But you see what happens when it gets to that place, you see black holes all over the universe. In fact, our galaxy, at the center of our galaxy and other galaxies are black holes. And in fact, it is the black hole that makes our galaxy spin. It is a black hole that makes other galaxy spins. You see, and this is what you see, by the way, in ancient Kemet and among the Dogon, is that they have this concept of things that spin and revolve and rotate. The Earth spins on its axis. The moon revolves around the Earth and spins on its axis. The Earth spins on its axis, revolves around the sun. The sun spins on its axis and revolves around the center of the galaxy. The galaxy spins on its axis and spins around the center of the cluster of galaxies to which it belongs. That cluster spins on its axis and revolves around a center around which the supercluster begins, so that everything spins, revolves, and rotates in a circular fashion. And you find this over and over again in Dogon thinking. You might say Dogon thinking even precedes these scientific ideas that we find becoming the avant-garde of what we think of as modern physics. And often these forces that are controlling the spinning and the movement of the universe are black holes. And it is thought that if you move through a black hole, you can move into another universe. You see, because modern physics tells us that at the time of the creation of this universe, everything in time-space was concentrated in a single speck smaller than a proton. And then at the point of creation, everything exploded. And that is when creation began 15 billion years ago. But it exploded into more than one universe. Well, the Dogon say exactly the same thing. The Dogon say there are maybe 28 universes that came into being. And this is what modern science tells us. In fact, the Dogon have a word for it. They say these universes were superposed at the beginning of creation. So in this cycle of creation, there are multiple universes existing side by side, and the African philosophy tells us this, but you see, there have been other creations. And even after this universe is gone, because if it had a beginning, it must have an end, there will be other universes. The Dogon say this as well. So you can begin to see how what science is doing is finally catching up with African thought that is already tens of thousands of years old. So with that as a mere introduction to our subject, let us get into, as I say, the heart of darkness. Now we're going to do this, yes, let's go ahead and turn on the slides. Let's dim only as many lights as we need to be able to see things. Let's try not to have total darkness if we can help it. We can get these lights up here. We are going to do what I call at first a geo-ethnic survey of ancient Kemet. Now, in some ways, this may not be necessary, but I like to do it anyway. So that when we talk about ancient Kemet, we have some visual sense of the people that we are referring to, because that's sometimes not that easy to dredge up. Why? Because we are constantly bombarded in the media with images of African civilization populated by people who do not look like African people. So we have to create our counter images, and it's something that we have to do time and time again. Okay, that's good. I like to try to avoid total darkness if we can, so why don't we just leave it at that, even though the image isn't as sharp as I'd like it to be, but I think it's enough for our purposes, because I like to be able to see the audience, and also because I have some things to share. Now, I like to show this because this is Northeast Africa, the Nile Valley, the land of Kemet and Cush, later called Egypt by the Greeks, which was not its original name. And as I like to tell audiences who are hearing this for the first time, Egypt is not now, nor has it ever been, in the Middle East. Egypt is not now, nor has it ever been in the Middle East. And indeed, what we call the Middle East, Syria, Palestine, etc., is really Africa's northeast extension. It is fundamentally a part of Africa when you get right down to it. That is true not only geographically, as you can see, but geologically. Now, why make this point? Because the term Middle East seems to be a rather harmless term on the face of it, but it distorts our whole geopolitical reality. Because you use the term Middle East to describe parts of Africa in a way that literally severs a large part of African territory, culture, and history from Africa itself. So it seems to be a harmless term, but it's very insidious. Really, it's very destructive. And it has no basis in reality. There is no such thing as the Middle East. It's an artifact. Now, okay. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. Before we do that, that's even better. Yeah. The point I like to make before we go on, though, is that when you think of Egypt and Nubia, Egypt and Sudan, or Kemet and Kush, you have to think of them more appropriately, I like to say, as one great cultural complex. Egypt came out of Ethiopia or Kush, and for the duration of the dynastic period of 4,000 years, they formed one great cultural complex. So less and less, I refer not so much to Kemet and Kush or Egypt and Nubia, but to Nile Valley civilization, as a way of understanding that we're talking about a civilization, a cultural complex that encompasses what I call Northeast Africa and indeed the Nile Valley. Next slide, please. Good. We're just going to look very quickly at some faces from ancient Kemet. This is, as you know, the Sphinx, the most famous monument in the world. Even though his nose is blown off, is African. The African character of his features are so unmistakable and clear that they are obvious to all. Next slide, please. It is the oldest and most famous monument in the world. The other thing about the Sphinx that we can say is that there is evidence now that it may be 2 or 3 times older than what we think. This evidence comes from the body of the Sphinx, but also the ditch around it, which has been fissured by cracks, very deep and very numerous, that could only come from the erosive effect of water, particularly rainwater. Well, it hasn't rained on a consistent basis in the Nile Valley for 7,000 years. So that means at the time that the Sphinx was built, it was still raining. So what it has led some geologists to conclude is that the Sphinx may, instead of being merely 4,500 years old or thereabouts, or 5,000 years old even, is maybe 7,000 to 10,000 years old. So that this being the architectural monument and engineering marvel that it is, it means that the civilization who built it is that old as well. So Kemet, therefore, is very likely 2 or 3 times older than what the history books tell us. Next slide, please. Narmer-Menes, the founder of the United Kingdom of the Two Lands, which were called Kemet, going back 6,000 years ago. Next slide, please, again. This is one of the, I think this is one of the Amenemhets of the Middle Kingdom, 4,000 years ago. Next slide, please. We'll do these relatively quickly. This is Djoser from the 3rd dynasty, the pharaoh under whom Imhotep worked. Next slide, please. This is again one of the Amenemhets. I think it's Amenemhet the 1st or 2nd from the Middle Kingdom of 4,000 years ago. The family of Amenemhet was from Nubia because the annals of Kemet say so. They themselves acknowledge their Nubian origins. Next slide, please. So the entire Middle Kingdom pharaohs were really Nubians. This is Tutmosis III from the 18th dynasty, the so-called Napoleon of antiquity, and certainly the greatest conqueror in antiquity, Mother Nubian also. Next slide, please. This is also one of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs who is wearing one of the crowns of Amun in his true and natural coloring. Next slide, please. Let's do these quickly. Mentuhotep II from the Middle Kingdom, represented in his true and natural coloring. Next slide, please. Amos Nefertari, one of the founding ancestress of the 18th dynasty, in her true and natural coloring. Next slide, please. King Tut in his true and natural coloring. Next slide, please. This is Amun, and it's either Amun or it's a pharaoh who has the crown of Amun. But notice again the coloring, either of both of Amun, who is the primary deity from the Middle Kingdom onward, or the pharaoh representing him. Next slide, please. This is from the tomb of Ramesses III, going back 3,200 years ago. This is a scene from that tomb showing you the 4 major ethnic groups with whom the ancient people of Kemet were in everyday contact. On the far right is a Yamu from Western Asia. Next to him is a Nahesi, or Nubian if you like, from the Sudan. Second from the left, third from the right is a Tehenu from the northern coast of Libya. And on the far left is a Rametu. Rametu was one of the ancient names of the people of Kemet for themselves. Notice that therefore the Egyptian, if you like, or the representative of Kemet and the representative of Nubia, the Sudan, are exactly the same, with the only difference is, excuse me, I know I'm kind of moving back and forth here, is that the Rametu has 3 tassels, the Nubian has but 2. So here in the tomb of Ramesses III, the people of ancient Kemet are in Technicolor are telling you who they are, what they look like, who they are related to, and where they come from. Next slide, please. Osiris, the most outstanding and important deity, the deity of resurrection for 4,000 years, represented as the great, as we saw at the beginning, he was called Kemwer, the great black one. Next slide, please. Akhenaten. Akhenaten, remarkable for a number of reasons, not the least of which he is the first and only pharaoh to allow himself and his family to be represented in portraiture and sculpture the way he actually looked. And therefore you can see the African features unmistakably, because he allowed himself to be painted the way or carved the way he really looked. Next slide, please. This is his daughter. He had 6 daughters. Note the longness of head and the prominence of jaw. Whenever you get that there's a scientific name for that longness of head. It's called dolichocephaly or dolichocephaly. When you see that and you see that and the jawline both together, you have a 99.9% certainty that that is an East African phenotype. Now, again, it's important to not to be afraid of certain kinds of words. Phenotype is another scientific term. It just means the sum total of your physical characteristics. Your hair, your eyes, your height, your skin color, etc. This, therefore, is an East African phenotype, and the way we know this, beyond my just telling you so, comes in the next slide. This is a Watutsi woman from the royal family more than 100 years ago. Again, notice that tendency to longness of head, prominence of lower jaw. It is as if she and the bust of Akhenaten's daughter that we saw on the earlier slide, they are sisters, you might say, even though separated by 3,000 years of time and 3,000 miles of space. Next slide, please. Let's keep going. We've got a lot to cover. If you were going to go to Africa today to look at people closest to what the people of Kemet might have looked like before the time of Christ, you might go to East Africa and Tanzania and Kenya, where you see a rather striking looking people known as the Maasai. This is a young woman from the Maasai people. Next slide, please. Or you would go to what is now Nubia, southern Egypt, and northern Sudan, where you see people looking like this. Next slide, please. Or you would go to the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia, where you'd see people belonging to the Danakil. Note the hairstyle, the coloration, the features. It is as if one of the portraits from ancient Kemet had come alive and taken flesh and blood in this rather striking looking portrait of this Danakil warrior from the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia. These are the faces of ancient Kemet that still survive among us, and others that we could show you. Next slide, please. Okay, now let us get into the heart of the matter, the heart of the matter. What is this? This is actually a granite cubit measurement. The Egyptian word for the word of Kemet was meh. Why do I make a point of this? They had several standards of measurement, but this was their most important one. It was their chief cubit. It was the measurement they used in the building of all sacred buildings. They used to make it out of black granite, and they used to keep it in a place that never varied more than 1 or 2 degrees from 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Why? Because stone and wood and anything else will contract and expand according to changes in temperature. So you keep it at a constant temperature so that the length, which is minutely and precisely determined, maintains itself as a standard for the entire country. So the cubit actually became itself a symbol of that which was right, exact, and precise. It became the standard of the builder and the scientist. And it became the image and the symbol of precision and exactitude. Next slide, please. Now let's jump back in time and space a little bit. You look at this, and on the left you see what is actually one bone. Although you see two pictures there, it's two sides of a single bone. That bone was discovered by a man by the name of Dogon in what is now Zaire, northeastern Zaire, in the Great Lakes region of Africa. He noticed some very interesting features about this bone, the most important of which are these markings that you see. These grouped markings were determined to be numbers. Not only were they numbers, but they were numbers that revealed a familiarity with the decimal system, prime numbers, and even multiplication by duplication, a phenomenon you find later on in mathematics in the Rin mathematical papyrus. This is, as you say, might call it a early or proto-mathematics. Well, Heinzelin at first said, well, this bone is about 8,500 years old. Well, that's fairly old, but there are other artifacts as old as that. But about, 7 years ago, they redated this bone. And what they found is that the bone wasn't 8,500 years old, it's 25,000 years old. Going back into the Paleolithic period, in the center of Africa, in the heart of Africa, in the heart of darkness, if you like, in the what I call the womb and the cradle land of race, the human race and culture. This is the example of proto-mathematics in place in Africa 25,000 years ago. Africa is not only the biological home of humanity and the cultural home of humanity, which it is where human culture begins, and of course it is where logically human civilization would have to begin. Next slide, please. Let us now fast forward in some sense about 20-odd thousand years later. This is the title page of the oldest formal textbook of mathematics. Goes back a mere 3,800 years ago in Northeast Africa in the Nile Valley. The Rind mathematical papyrus, the title page, in which it says, technique or method for finding all hidden, to uncover all hidden things and to plumb all secrets, which I think is a very interesting title for a mathematical textbook, if I must say so myself. Next slide, please. The Rind mathematical papyrus and the three other mathematical fragments that have survived from ancient Kemet show that they were completely familiar with the theory of numbers and arithmetic. This is problem number 24, which shows that they had the ability of finding the solution of an equation by means of an unknown. That, by definition, is algebra. Now, the reason why this is important is because your history of mathematicians say that algebra was invented 1,500 years later. And here is an algebra, and there are other algebraic problems that you can find in these ancient mathematical textbooks from Northeast Africa. Next slide, please. This is problem number 51, which gives you the formula for finding the area of a triangle, 1/2 base times height. So where this is relatively basic geometry. Next slide, please. But problem number 56 is something else. Problem number 56, let me see if I can, actually, it might be better if I get my glasses on and actually read this a little bit. Yes. Problem number 56 in the Rin mathematical papyrus, that's the one you see up there, seeks to find the slope of a pyramid whose height is 250 cubits and whose base is 360 cubits. The answer is 5 1/25 palms for each cubit in height, representing the cotangent of the angle of the slope of the pyramid's face. Now, if you've got a cotangent, if you can find cotangents, you know the way you can find tangents is that you flip the cotangent over. It's the inverse of a tangent. The other thing, too, just look at that. Imagine that pyramid is three-dimensional, because that's what it's supposed to be. Now, all you really have to do is inscribe a triangle inside that pyramid, a right triangle whose height is also the same as the height of the pyramid. Therefore, the face becomes the hypotenuse, and half of the pyramid's base becomes the base of that right triangle, and then the height of the pyramid becomes the height of the right triangle. When you have all that in place, and it's really just a matter of drawing it in, you then can find sine and cosine. So now, if they have the tangent and cotangent and the ability to find sine and cosine, by definition, they have trigonometry. Now, the reason why I make that point is because every historian of science tells you that trigonometry wasn't invented until Hipparchus did 1,500 years later. Now, you see, we're not just talking about rudimentary calculation, we are now moving into the realm of higher mathematics, the foundation of all mathematics. Next slide, please. It even gets more sophisticated yet. This is actually older than the written mathematical papyrus, going back to the Old Kingdom. What you saw at the top, see the top is a scale drawing of the curve whose particulars are indicated on the ancient diagram shown below. And that's an architect's diagram defining a curve by its coordinates. So now you've moved into the realm of coordinate geometry. Now this is now nearly 6,000 years old. So I always ask black students of every level, why are you afraid of mathematics when your ancestors invented it? Why would you want to give it up and give it away when it is a product of Africa? Next slide, please. For those of you who have been to Kemet, you have undoubtedly seen the Temple of Dendera. Behind the Temple of Dendera, which is dedicated to Hathor, or Het-Her, is a chapel dedicated to Isis. There is a place as you move into the central vestibule of the chapel dedicated to Isis, where you have to imagine that this is actually up above you. There is this square aperture down through which light beams or shines. You see, now you look at these, what these represent are really light waves or white light beams. But you see, they have waveforms. So here, they are demonstrating that the people of ancient Kemet understood that light moves in waves. That wasn't known in Europe until Newton and Christian Huygens in the 17th century. That's about 2,000 years later. Next slide. In fact, they are very ingenious in their use of light. Those of you who have been and seen the temples and the tombs will note that you can go into the deepest, darkest, most inaccessible recesses of the temples, and you will find these brilliantly colored, very precise scenes. And yet there's no soot or any evidence of combustion. So that means they didn't use candles. Now, unless you're going to say that they used electricity, and I don't even want to get into that just yet, let's take a simple answer and then speculate later about electricity. Is that what they apparently did, though, which was equally as effective as electricity, was they used a system of mirrors to bring light in from the surface all the way into the deepest, darkest recesses of the temple in such a way that they could literally light up the entire temple that way. Next slide, please. Now, this is what you all came to hear, believe it or not, so let's spend some time with it. We've already talked about that the Earth is not just a static ball in space. It's not only smooth, but it spins. It spins on its axis. But because of the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon, it doesn't spin in a straight up and down spinning motion. It floats because of the gravitational attraction. Now, those of you who have children and or grandchildren, and if you've ever bought a top for them, go home tonight and spin the top. If you don't spin the top completely straight up and down, you will find that while the top is spinning, it wobbles and describes a circle. Well, that is exactly what the Earth does, and that circle that top makes as it wobbles is called the precession. So that the Earth, the celestial North Pole, wobbles around the North Pole of the ecliptic, which is the vertical North Pole, in a period of 26,000 years. This is a period that was discovered in Africa minimally 50,000 years ago. Now, what did they do? Well, they did a couple of things. Over the years after they had discovered this phenomenon, they divided this circle into two different cycles or circles, one around the equator and one around the North Pole of the ecliptic. The one around the equator was divided into 12 arcs, and in each arc there was a constellation given to define the arc. And with 26,000 years, what you would do is that you would stand at the first day of spring, the spring equinox, and watch what constellation rose at dawn. And that would be the constellation that defined the age. But that if you watch for 2,160 years, slowly but surely that constellation would move out of that position and another constellation would move in its place. And if you stood there for 26,000 years, the original constellation would come back that you first started to observe. Well, you can do the same thing for the North Pole. But you see, in the North Pole, there are only 7 constellations, so it's 3,700 years. But both of them are what they call great years. Now, what we're in the constellation right now is that rises at the spring equinox is Pisces. But Pisces is moving, in 100 years, will move off of the horizon, and Aquarius will move in its place. Now, Aquarius now is called the Waterman, but Aquarius wasn't the Waterman to begin with. Aquarius was the great mistress of the waters, Hathor Nut. And later, we turned into the Waterman as Hapi. And you note that to show you that Hapi was originally female, Hapi, the god of the Nile, and that her Nile has a female breast. Well, what we're interested in actually, we're interested in that, yes. And we're also interested in what happens around the North Pole. Because you see, right now what's in place, the North Pole star is in the constellation of the Great Bear. Little Bears. But the Little Bear is a Greek term. According to, if you go back into this planisphere of Dendera and Kemet, it wasn't a little bear at all, it was a jackal. And this is the reason why jackals, wolves, foxes, and dogs have such importance, right? Have had such importance over the last 3,000 years, symbolically. And we could go into that, but for lack of time, let's move on. But what is getting ready to happen, however, is that these 2 cycles are getting ready to coincide for the only twice in 26,000 years that they do that, at the beginning of the cycle and in the middle of the cycle. Where we're in the middle of a 26,000 year cycle, and in the next 100 years, the 2 cycles will coincide. We've already talked about Hathor Nut, the great mother of the waters. But, next slide, please. Okay, and this shows you what happens, okay? This just shows you what happens. This is the North Star, and slowly but surely, this is the North Star. The North Stars change every 3,700 years, and slowly but surely, the constellations change every 2,160 years. So this shows you the two phenomena of the great year, the 2 precessions, both defined by the same phenomenon. Next slide, please. And this is the zodiac of Dendera, which shows you the entire Egyptian heaven, northern heaven in particular, and the whole phenomenon of the precession. We don't have time to go into detail on that because we could do an entire lecture just on this. Next slide, please. But here, next slide, please. Next slide, please. But here is where it comes home in a very immediate way that we can all understand. This is the northern heaven. You see, here is the great little bear, and that's Polaris. That's the North Star now. But 100 years, it won't be the North Star, and therefore the little bear, or really the jackal, won't be the defining constellation of the polar age. Who is moving? Because it is this constellation that is moving into place in the North Pole position. Now, even though the drawing doesn't show you this, it is Cepheus, but when Cepheus moves into the North Pole position in about 100 years or less, and by the way, those effects are already being felt, because when you move from one age to the next, the effects are felt for at least 150 years to 200 years even before you get to that point. Now, but who is Cepheus? Cepheus is the Ethiopian king. You wonder why the Million Man March happened the way it happened? It was cosmically preordained. Cepheus, even though he doesn't look like an Ethiopian, that's what he is. He's the Ethiopian king in mythology. He is going to be the ruler of the next age, So it's the black Ethiopian king who will rule the next age. And now you can see why the Million Man March happened the way it did, why it drew that many men in one place, right around the lake that's designed after the lake at Karnak, next to the Ben stone. So you have to understand, Jesus himself said, there will be portents in the sun and moon and stars, and the celestial powers will be shaken. The celestial powers will be shaken, yes, because this celestial power will move and another celestial power will be in place, and that will be the celestial power of the Black King. It's not because I want it to be that way, it is because what God and nature and the cosmos intended. So we are being pulled along by cosmic forces that we are only dimly aware of. And our history, therefore, is cosmically determined. Even the reassertion of the principle that has been evident for the last 15 years is cosmically determined because it is Hathor Nut who is going to find the next zodiac, the next zodiacal age in the same time, 100 years. So it's going to be the great mother of the waters walking hand in hand with the Ethiopian king that will determine world history for the next 2,000 years. Next slide, please. This is just one of the methods. We have no evidence that they had telescopes, but they had very effective methods, even without a lot of sophisticated apparatus, for making the most refined and precise measurements of heavenly bodies. And this is one of them, to give you the declination and azimuth of stars that are rising and setting over the horizon. Next slide, please. Now, look at this. Those of you who've been to Kemet will recognize it immediately as the Temple of Karnak. Karnak is so large, it was a city within a city. It was the holy city. It was a god. It was the original Vatican. It could hold and support 50,000 people. Because if you've ever been there, the place is just mammoth. It's huge. And if you take the regular tour, it doesn't give you all of it. But I want you see this. This is the central corridor, the central alignment of Karnak. You, as you are watching it, are standing at the west. Now, that central axis is actually oriented in such a way, it is oriented to the western hills so precisely that on the first day of summer, June 21st, as the sun sets over the western hills, and just before it goes down the hills, it throws a thin shaft of light right down that corridor. And it doesn't do that anymore, but it did when it was built. And it flashed for 5 minutes on the Holy of Holies in the sanctuary. You got to understand, you see, these pylons and gates were narrow. They narrow and narrow and narrow, and there was the roof over Karnak. And so what they did is that they concentrated the beam of light in the exact same way cameras and telescopes do. So it wasn't just a temple, it was also an almanac and a calendar. Next slide, please. Now, the Great Pyramid. Yeah, yes. As you know, the Washington Monument is just a copy of the Ben stone, which is the sacred monument of the so-called obelisk, which was sacred to the sun. We could spend a whole lecture doing nothing but that. Now, when Napoleon conquered Egypt in 1798, he brought an army of technicians and surveyors with him, and scientists. The first thing he asked them to do was to measure his new domain. Well, they found out that their job was very easy, because all they had to do was project an imaginary line through the middle of the pyramid due north, and where it crossed the Mediterranean coast, it bisected the delta into two equilateral triangles, which could therefore be measured by trigonometry. So if Napoleon could do that, then the priest-physician, or the priest-scientist who put that in place could do that. Let's continue. Next slide, please. The pyramid rises to a height of 481.5 feet. It is built of 2.7 million blocks of stone. The smallest stone is 2.5 tons, and the largest stone is somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. If you were to take the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid, by the way, can you hear me in the back? I don't want you to miss any of this. If you could take all of the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid and cut it up into 1-foot blocks, you could build a wall that would circle 2/3 of the globe. And you know they built it without even using the wheel? They used to float 1,000-ton blocks of granite from Aswan 500 miles down the river, and they can't even do that today. The pyramid was oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The base of the pyramid, the side of each base of the pyramid was 755 feet, 6 inches, with an average error of 1/10,000th. The casing stones that covered the pyramid were so finely jointed that you could not and cannot insert a piece of your hair in between the joints, even today, where they are still in existence. The area of the base of the pyramid is 13 acres. But it's real interesting. If you look at the height of the pyramid, it is, if you measure it, it is the radius of a circle that you can create by turning the base of the square base of the pyramid into a circle. And therefore, you can find the square base by the area of the perimeter of the square base by 2 pi r. So that means they had built the constant, the geometric constant of pi, into the pyramid. The descending passage was precisely aligned to the North Pole star that was in place 3,350 years BC, and it used to shine down to the grotto into a pool of water. And of course, it's only in that place once every 26,000 years. The so-called ventilating shaft of the King's Chamber oriented exactly to Orion in the southern heavens, and the one from the Queen's Chamber is oriented exactly to Sirius, also in the southern heaven. There has never been anything like it in the world. Nothing. Do you know the other thing about the Great Pyramid? Where the Great Pyramid sits, if you were to take all the longitude, there are 360 degrees of longitude around the Earth, right? The longitude of the Great Pyramid goes through more landmass than any other longitude in the world. The latitude of the Great Pyramid, going right through the Great Pyramid, goes through more latitudinal landmass than any other latitude in the world. So the Great Pyramid, from the point of view of land, is the center of the Earth. This is the reason why that not only in Egypt, but in Greece, Rome, Palestine, India, and China build their cities in fixed intervals to the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid was the prime meridian. The prime meridian we got now going through Greenwich, England, is a complete artifact. It's not based on anything. The original prime meridian was the Great Pyramid. Next slide, please. In early spring, when the sun rises just high enough above the apex of the Great Pyramid, the whole shadow of the north face vanishes at the stroke of noon, and therefore they can tell the beginning of the first day of spring. Next slide, please. Let's read the legend. The truncated pyramid depicted by Proctor would have made an observation platform 142 feet high and 175 feet square. The cardinal points or compass roads could have been marked by the upright posts on the periphery of the platform To locate the rising and setting of stars east and west, azimuth observers could occupy the center of the square from which they could command the entire compass. What happened was, before they finished the pyramid, they stopped construction. This is at the 50th course. The 50th course is exactly half the area of the base. And from there, they made all of these observations and measurements. Then they finished. They did that maybe for a year, and then they finished the pyramid. Next slide, please. It just so happened what we call the Grand Gallery, which points directly south on the 50th concourse. According to Proctor, a 19th century astronomer, when you look at this, what they call, there's a word for it, I'm forgetting it. You see this kind of shape here, where it's kind of beveled like that. He says, no architect by himself would ever make an opening with this kind of a shape. He says, the only ones to whom that would be necessary would be astronomers. Because what they would do is that they would post trained sky watchers up and down this gallery, so at night they could take measurement after measurement of these stars moving across this meridian. That means they could determine a meridian in the sky, which is a longitude, and they could determine a meridian on the Earth. They could also determine the speed of this star moving across this meridian, and therefore that would allow them to determine the speed of the rotation of the vault of heaven, which is another way of saying they could determine the speed of the rotation of Earth. Next slide, please. I'm gonna, in the interest of time, let's go on because there's some other, I want to get to something else. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Piri-Reis map. The Piri-Reis map was compiled in 1513 by a Turkish admiral by the name of Piri-Reis. He had 20 maps at his disposal. One came from Columbus, and I'll tell you in a minute where the others came from. Now you look at this map, I hope you can see it. You see the western bulge of Africa, you see Spain, the Mediterranean, the eastern prominence of South America, the Caribbean, and Antarctica. You see these compass roses and these lines moving in diagonal directions from the compass roses, but you see all of these particular features of the map are in correct latitudinal and longitudinal relationship to one another. Map making of this exactitude wasn't even possible in Europe until 250 years later, because it wasn't until then that they could even determine longitude. This map was compiled from earlier maps that were even more accurate and even more sophisticated, and these maps, according to Piri-Reis himself, came from the time of Alexander, 300 years BC. But what does that mean? When we say time of Alexander, that's just a time. Where was the center of the map? And remember, this is called a Portolano map. The center of the map would be the place where, in a sense, the map was built, where the original maps were situated. You look at these compass roses. These represent the left ring of a perfect circle. You can see that the map is torn off. If the map was complete, you would see the rest of Africa, Asia, India, etc. But it is possible through trigonometry to determine the center of the map, and therefore the place where the map makers themselves were situated, 300 BC and earlier. Next slide, please. Again, this just shows you diagrammatically the compass roses as a left rim of a circle through the Atlantic. Next slide, please. The center of the map was determined after 2 years of numerous calculations to be 23.5 degrees north and 30 degrees east. Now, where is that? Next slide, please. It's 100 miles west of Aswan in Upper Egypt. Now you got to understand something. To have made a map like this, not only would they have had to have precise knowledge of Africa, South America, Europe, they would have to have precise knowledge of the entire world. You got to understand something. The idea that nobody started sailing oceans until Columbus decided to do so, at least not the Atlantic Ocean, is a fiction. Again, it has nothing to do with historical reality. or across the Pacific, for that matter. How did the Hawaiians get to Hawaii? A people from the Tongan Islands sailed in catamaran canoes, not once, but in waves, over 3,000 miles of open ocean, using only the stars and their knowledge of the movement of waves and how clouds form and wind patterns to guide them. There was an African kingdom called a city called Malindi on the East African coast that sent in 1415, 80 years before Columbus, a giraffe across the Indian Ocean and up the South China Sea to the Emperor of China. The Greeks, there are 6 surviving Greek references to a land across the Atlantic with valleys, rivers, and mountains. So you gotta understand, there was already a worldwide network of trade, diplomacy, commerce, overland and across all seas when the Spanish and Portuguese came and took it away. It involved everybody: African, Arab, Asian, and Amerindian. And it went back at least 2,000 years, 2,500 years before Columbus. You can see what has been done to history. History has been turned upside down on its head. Because, you see, if you deconstruct history, then when it's put back together, you can put it back in your own image. And every so often, less now than formerly, I will go in front of an audience, and a black person will stand up. Well, Dr. Finch, why is this important? It's all very well and nice, and it's all very well and good. It makes us feel good, but why study history? What does that have to do with our problems today? And I said, nobody but a black American would ever ask that question. The Chinese would never ask it. Europeans would never ask it. Mexicans, the only time I ever hear it asked is by a black American, because they know the function of history. Your problem today is a function or a product of history and your perception of it. That's what Sheikh Anta Diop said. He talked about the collective amnesia of people of African descent, causing a depersonalization, an alienation, a loss of sense of self and belonging, which to me is an acceptable definition of mental illness. Next slide, please. This was found in Saqqara, dated to 300 BC, and at first was said to be a bird, until a NASA engineer said, next slide, please, birds do not have reverse dihedral wings and vertical tails. He said this is a glider and an aerodynamically sound glider. Not an airplane, but it just shows you that in African science, they had already started experimenting with aerodynamics 300 years before Jesus was born. So again, why are we afraid to be engineers? Next slide, please. It wasn't Justin Kemet. You say, oh, Dr. Finch, this is just a bunch of stones looking like they're getting ready to fall over. Well, funny thing about those stones in what is now northwestern Kenya, in Namaratunga, they look like they're getting ready to fall over, next slide, are oriented precisely to 7 major stars or star groupings. And the people then and now use the risings, particularly of this star, Triangulum, and all the rest of them, correlated with phases of the moon to create their own calendar. There is no other calendar like it anywhere in the world. In fact, all of your major calendars are African. Lunar calendar, stellar calendar, solar calendar, calendar based on the movements of Sirius. And this calendar is just, nobody knows, has found anything else like it anywhere else. Next slide, please. You say, okay, what are these men standing up next to? Well, what they're standing up next to is actually a iron smelter and steel maker, 10 feet high, made of termite mud and/or anthill mud. Why? Because termite mud and anthill mud is impermeable to water. You see those blowholes here. Usually they're 8 to 10, excuse me. Next slide. And what they do is they blow in preheated air in such a way that at the combustion zone, they're able to achieve temperatures of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody was able to do that until 150 years ago, anywhere else in the world. It allowed, because they were able to achieve such high temperatures so efficiently, and this technology goes back to Tanzania and East Africa 2,500 years ago. When the iron separated from the ore, it didn't clump like it usually does, but it crystallized. And it allowed them to, the only difference between iron and steel is 1.5% carbon. It gives a steel a greater hardness of iron from anywhere from 10 to 30 times. And they were able to control the introduction of steel into the carbon into the iron, creating the steel that was so valuable that it became the best steel in the world, because India used to send its merchants to East Africa for this steel. And then they went it back to India, and that is where they created wood steel, and they used that to make the famous Damascus swords. So Damascus swords were made from this East African steel. There were 4 other places in Africa, in Ethiopia, Ghana, and Nigeria, where this technique was used that we know of, and maybe there were more, but we know about those 4. In Ghana, they had actually smelted steel using this technique, and a metallurgist came and brought a diamond drill with him, could not even scratch the steel, because diamond can cut anything, couldn't even scratch this steel. And this is a totally African innovation. Next slide, please. Well, now, let us get to the Dogon. These are people living along the Bandiagara cliffs in what is now southeastern Mali. They live in what I might describe as a post-Neolithic stage of existence, because they live in the most harsh, unforgiving part of Mali. Nobody else could live there. And yet they have found ways of cultivating sufficient crops to support a population of 250,000 people, whereas it really should be supporting maybe no more than 20,000 people. And they've been there for 700 years. Next slide, please. These are the Dogon informants that gave the information which we are about to consider. Next slide, please. One of them is a woman. This one is actually a female priestess. Next slide, please. Like ancient Kemet, a good bit of the Dogon star and calendar system centers around Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the heavens. This is a great time at this time of year to see it, because it's really most brilliant in the winter sky. All you do is you look at the southern heavens right about now, look for Orion, and look for the 3 belts of Orion and follow it right down, and there Sirius is. Outside the solar system, the brightest of the heavenly bodies. And the source of the calendar, ancient calendar of Kemet and the Dogon. The Dogon have 4 calendars also. One of them is based on Sirius. But what is more interesting from the point of view of Dogon is that they have a system around this body right there. These are artifacts. These are not, but this is actually a star. That star is called, by modern scientists, Sirius B. The Dogon call it Potolo, the seed star or the star of deep beginnings. Well, what about Potolo, called Sirius B? The Dogon have apparently known about it for 700 years. It was not discovered in the West until 1862. The reason why it was so difficult to see is because it is a white dwarf star. The Dogon call it a white. What is a white dwarf? A star, when our sun, or a star the size of the sun, comes to the end of its life and exhausts its fuel, it will first expand into a red giant, and the sun will gobble up the entire solar system as far as Mars, but then it'll become so big that it will have to collapse down, and it will collapse down in a mighty explosion to a white dwarf. So the sun will become the size of maybe the moon. So all that mass is concentrated in a small body. The weight of a single teaspoon of a white dwarf like Sirius B is about 100 tons because it is so small, dense, and heavy. The Dogon describe all of this. They describe Sirius B as being a white seed, is what they call it. It's very small, very dense, and very heavy. The Dogon say that it is composed of a metal not found on Earth they call Sagala, and it has been determined through spectrographic analysis that is exactly what it is composed of, a degenerate metal. They even describe, you see, when a red giant explodes to contract down a white dwarf, that is a nova explosion. It lights up the sky. The Dogon described that. The connections between white dwarfs and supernovas weren't even known until 1914. The Dogon even describe matter being made up of incredibly small spinning particles, i.e. atoms. They describe all of the constellations of being composed of countless of stars spinning in space as galaxies. They describe the 4 moons of Jupiter, and these people, to all intents and purposes, don't have even a system of writing that we know about, at least not one that anyone has ever discovered. They have, therefore, a knowledge of the cosmos and of the heavens and astronomy that rivals modern knowledge. Next slide, please. This is the trajectory of the star Digitaria around Sirius, 50 years, which they also describe. Next slide, please. This is a Dogon tribal diagram. This is a modern astronomical diagram. Next slide, please. These are some of the other constellations described by the Dogon. Next slide, please. This is Jupiter and its 4 major moons described by the Dogon. Next slide, please. This is a Dogon representation of a supernova explosion that creates white dwarfs. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to wrap this up in about 5 minutes or so, but I'm going to read from some material that I have, and I want you to keep your eye on this. Now just bear with me. I got to read something to you, and it'll become significant in about 3 or 4 minutes. I'm reading from something called the Pale Fox. This is a description. This is a Dogon verbal description that I'm reading. It is said, the Nomo Anagono is the first living thing created by Amma, the creator. The word for catfish, anagono, means rain and also sinuate. Ana also means man, whose seed on the mythical plane is associated with the fertilizing rain and fresh water. The term Ana foretells that the living being will become man. It is said, the Nomo Anagono, which is the archetypal man or human being, if you want, you might say, that Amma created inside the Po. The Po is the seed. Amma, who created the Po, has made the image of Nomo Anagono inside. This is the image of the archetypal man inside this creative Po, or this creative seed. Now listen to this. The gestation of the Nomo Anagono took place slowly inside Amma's womb. Of the 66 Yala, Yala are the marks of infinite potentiality. Of the 66 Yala of the central spiral, Amma kept 22. Those of the Po, he bestowed the remaining 44 upon the Nomo Anagono. Now these final 8 Yala prefigure here the 4 body souls and 4 sex souls of the being in formation. The creation of the Nomo catfish prefigures the creation of man, who also begins with fire, for semen is the fire in the womb. The penetration of the four fundamental elements took place during the development of the principal organs of the nomo-onogono inside the egg. To emphasize their respective roles, one compares the yellow of Amma's egg with those of the egg of the nomo-onogono by saying the yellow of Amma's egg is like an egg with its yolk and its germ. Its germ. Keep that in mind. The yellow of the nomo-onogono caused the elongation, enlargement, and growth of the world. In fact, the form being will be complete and alive. Let's go back over this. Of the 66 yala of the central spiral, Amma kept 22, those of the Po, and bestowed the remaining 44 on the nomo-onogono. Let us go now to a medical dictionary. Autosome. Any ordinary paired chromosome, an autosome is any ordinary paired chromosome as distinguished from a sex chromosome. In man, there are 44 total autosomes. Let's repeat something else. These final 8 yala prefigure here the 4 body souls and 4 sex souls of the being in formation. Remember, we know these yala are chromosomes because he says germ, and that's what chromosomes are. The creation, we said the 4 body souls and 4 sex souls, the essentials of genetics. Although there are 4 sperm produced from the original cell, the sperm are only of 2 kinds in terms of chromosomal content. The 2 positions possible through the random alignment of 2 pairs of chromosomes will produce 4 different kinds of sperm or germ cells. The Dogon just call them sex cells. Now, we've talked about chromosomes and therefore genetics. We've talked about 4 kinds of sperm cells and germ cells. We've talked about embryology, the development inside the womb, growth, development, enlargement. I want you to look at this very carefully. Look at that, look at that. Now go to the next slide. Mitosis and meiosis. Go back to your high school biology. Yeah, go back again, yes. Do it again, yeah, go back. Oh. That won't go back. Sorry. It's all right, it's all right. We're getting close to the end. Obviously, we are dealing with a realm and quality of thought that achieves very sophisticated empirical scientific information by means that most of us don't understand. Now, I'm coming close to the end. I want to finish this off with a discussion called the work of the spider. Now the spider is he who holds the threads of the fox, have been delegated by the Creator to watch the deeds of the fox and to report them to the Creator. Instead, the spider entered the acacia in order to weave the words of Ogo the fox. Placed at the center of the acacia, the spider wove its threads in a conical spiral for the placement of the warp and by moving vertically for the coming and going of the passing wolf. Through the fabric, it sifted the germs that had been hurled into the universe by the spinning. The sound of its work, of the same nature of the word, grabbed them as they passed by and with them fastened itself at the crossing of the threads. Now, I'm going to read to you from The Unification of Physics by Stephen Hawking, A Brief History of Time. Basic objects are not particles, but things that have a length, like an infinitely thin piece of string. A string's history in space-time is a 2-dimensional surface called the world sheet. Particles like the proton and the neutron could be regarded as waves on a string. The strong forces between the particles would correspond to pieces of a string that went between each other bits of string as in a spider's web. Finally, Dogon. The formation of a carousel gave the image of the curve of the universe. Einstein made the revolutionary suggestion that gravity is a consequence of the fact that space-time is curved. We can have the lights on now. What I have tried to do in a relatively short period of time is to introduce you to the possibilities of African science, which is cosmic. It's not merely cosmic, but it encompasses all planes. I work extensively with traditional healers in West Africa, and particularly in Senegal, 2 different groups of them. And in fact, we are bringing a traditional healing ceremony from Senegal to South Carolina in August, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. One of them is a Vodou adept, who is also a physician. Vodou is from Benin, what used to be Dahomey, and of course is the source of voodoo. He talks about, he says, there are 2 kinds of medicines that are based on 2 different conceptions of man. If you look at the traditional conception of man in Africa, there is the biophysical, there is the emotional, there is the mental psychic, there is the spiritual, and then there's the cosmic, and then there's the God, the God consciousness. And he says all of those make up the human being. And in the process of healing, which is a restoration of the balance of forces, you have to take all of them into account. He says modern medicine, and therefore modern science, only takes the first and smallest and least significant portion into account, the biophysical. Now, it shows you, in the African framework, everything is connected. The smallest act reverberates literally through the entire cosmos. Why? Because you see, modern physics has come to a brick wall. Modern physics recognizes 4 dimensions: length, width, height, and time. But they are finding that there is another dimension of the universe which they don't want to deal with because it encompasses the other 4 dimensions, and that dimension is mind or consciousness. Why? Because even modern quantum mechanics tells you the very act of perceiving something changes it. That means there is no such thing as absolute objectivity. There is a vital nexus between the perceiver and the thing perceived that connects them together. So that in terms of physics, the limit is the speed of light. But if you go to the 5th dimension, what we call mind or consciousness, one of the realms in which African adepts work, it encompasses mind and consciousness. It encompasses time, space, and therefore it is possible, 1, to transcend the speed of light. It is possible to be in 2 places at once, and it is possible literally to go to the ends of the universe. This is African science. A science in which there was no conflict between the empirical and the mystic, material and spiritual, because they're all part of a continuum. And so there are adepts in Africa who literally can move between worlds. Therefore, in some sense, the term science might even be a misnomer. You might say it is an African thought that encompasses all thought. As a consequence of my work with one group of traditional healers, I was adopted into her family. Her name is Aji Fatou Sek, of the Lebu people of Senegal. She is an Ndip Kat. Ndip is the pre-Islamic Wolof, Lebu Wolof spiritual tradition that may be somewhere between 10 and 50,000 years old. Nobody knows. And she is its greatest practitioner living today. And probably Senegal, most powerful spiritual personality. She is now 93. Because I have been adopted as her son, she has charged me with a great responsibility. She has one last will and testament. Before she goes home, because there is evidence or there is indications that she will be called home soon by virtue of her age, and you know where I mean by home, she has charged me with this responsibility of organizing an 8-day healing ceremony here in the United States to establish the African spiritual presence and healing presence here. So it's going to happen August 11th through 19th, Penn Center, St. Helena Island, South Carolina. The first time, we know about African-derived religions in the Western Hemisphere. We know about Santeria, Candomblé, Vodou. But this will be the first time in the history on this hemisphere, where an authentic African spiritual healing ceremony will be bodily lifted out of Africa and brought with 20 priestesses, 5 drummers, 2 ritualists, and 2 interpreters put here for the purpose to establish the connection between African ancestors and their lost children in America, because that's the way they are conceived, for the purpose of the healing necessary to meet the challenges of the new age. I'm finished. I realized it was getting late, so I didn't know whether questions would be in order, but I'm more than happy to take a few questions. Yes, sir. Okay. One, how much of an explanation should I give, because it can get involved. The most important cosmic spiritual presence in this system is Kumbalamba. She is female, and her element is the ocean. So this has to be done near the ocean. St. Helena Island is Gullah country. Penn Center is owned and operated, controlled by the Gullah people. So it was almost the only place to go. Yes, sir. Whose? No, I've heard the title, but no, I haven't read it myself. You're talking about the Dogon? Yes, uh-huh. Yes, sir.
A couple of questions. One is, you are the brilliant man that you are. You have been trained in medicine and science, and you are, in a sense, involved in this stuff that has been tabooed by the very people who trained you in medicine, etc. It is evident that your love is in the very thing they tabooed you against. Would you say something to us about how they destroy things for us, like the Dogon, Candomblé, Santeria, and now the new African healing that you're talking about?
Okay, that in itself is a long and intense discussion, but let me just throw a fact at you that may, in sum it up. There has been work by a demographic historian, Louise Myers Jope, She's a demographic historian on Africa in particular. She has determined that at 1500 AD, 8 years after Columbus blundered on America, but 1500 AD, the population of the continent of Africa was at a bare minimum 600 million people. By 1900 AD, 400 years later, that population was 100 million. It was a Holocaust of unimaginable proportions. The only other people who suffered a Holocaust comparable to that was Native Americans. Within 50 years after Cortez had conquered the Aztecs, 50 million Aztecs had dwindled down to 500,000. They had killed, basically 50 million Indians had died in 50 years. You know, the Spaniards had a real interesting technique of pacifying and conquering Indians. They used to train these huge Mastiff dogs in Cuba to attack Indians when they were going to war against them. Whenever there was a campaign against Indians, and they took these Mastiff dogs with them, they also took Indian captives with them. Do you know what those Indian captives were for? To feed the dogs. I think those figures speak for themselves. What can I say? There was just never anything ever like that remotely compares to the last 500 years. I've been spending more and more time getting involved with Native Americans and their rituals because I've been invited to them. And what they tell me is that, first of all, I have never yet met an Indian, they call them Indian in Native America, who has ever expressed the slightest doubt that there were Africans who came to America prior to Columbus. That creates no problem. In fact, you know why? Because their own traditions tell them so. That's number one. They also said that their elders and wise persons, what they call the medicine people, told them on the eve of on the eve of Columbus's discovery of America and Cortez's conquest of Aztecs, that they were in for a bad 500 years. But at the end of that 500 years, it was going to switch back around. Really what they had to do was survive it. And that 500 years is up. Arrogance, no question about it. Black people, African people, one thing that we have to develop the ability to do is look at what was in ourselves. Cheikh Anta Diop talks about the internal contradictions in African society that laid it open to conquest. We haven't been willing to look at that because in some sense it means taking a certain amount of responsibility for what we let happen to Africa. Do you know that there were African adepts who actually sold their knowledge to the Tubab? Tubab is the Senegal name for European, a white person. Sold it. Some of it was that. There was kind of a venality. There was unquestionably a certain kind of arrogance and taking that knowledge and using it for nefarious ends. That knowledge and that power. Because when you have been in Africa and you have been around the people that I've been around and you have been in touch with this unimaginable spiritual power, you ask yourself the same question. And these are the kinds of answers you come up with, is that at some point, you know, we brought it on ourselves. We opened ourselves up for it. Oh, I mean, it's like what we all do. It's like what we all do. Sometimes what you find, and this is one thing it took me a while to learn, just because you have evolved, it doesn't necessarily that when you get to that stage of evolution that you have undergone the necessary moral transformation as well. Your arrogance just sort of expands with the power and knowledge that you get. And you might say you got farther to fall. You got, you know. So that, and you get to the place where you feel invulnerable. You get to the place where you feel like nothing can happen to you, that you can get away with it. It's still happening. So it isn't all, we have this idea that just because we can see more, hear more acutely, that we can perform more, we have more control over these things, that it necessarily makes us better individuals, it makes us more balanced individuals. That isn't always the case. In fact, what happens is that whole thing about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You got to be very careful about the corrupting influences of power. Because, at any given time, there are many different futures. There are many different futures. Now, there are some of us who have ability to see better what future is coming as opposed to, but there are many different futures. But there is a principle. It's called it's a trickster principle. It's Eshu and Legba. That just when you think that you have control over time and space, they do something. There is something that turns it around on you. Just when you think you have it at your grasp, and you got to take that into consideration. It is the reason why in Vodou and Candomblé they always pay homage to Eshu and Legba first, because if you don't, then your best efforts are going to go astray. So. My whole point is that also you become blind, too. You become, and also it's also not always easy. And I experience this myself. I mean, I always tell my friends, I'm good at giving advice. I love giving advice. Now I say, what I need to be better at is taking some of my own advice. What am I trying to say is simply this, is that people who can see for other people have a very difficult time seeing for themselves. Yes, sir, in the back. Yeah. Sir, I may need you to stand up because I'm not catching everything you're saying. The Sigui, yeah, that's a little confusing to me because I thought that the Sigui festival was imminent this decade, but I'm told no, that the last one was actually in the 70s. So I'm kind of confused as to the timing on that, to tell you the truth. Now, they do have other kinds of festivals, but the Sigui festival is the one that happens every 60 years. And I myself am a little confused because I'm told that the most recent one has already happened, and the next one won't happen until well into the next century. Maybe one more question before we bring it to a close. Yes, sir. What about them? The Dogon is a name. Are you asking me what is the Dogon? No, Dogon is a name of a people who live in Mali. They're the people that we talked about for about the last 15 minutes. They're the ones who had all this knowledge about Sirius B. They're the ones that had all this knowledge about the universe, the cosmos, about embryology. That's the name of a people who live in Mali. And that's who we were talking about for the last 15 minutes of the presentation. Again, thank you very much.
I want to